The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. This week we're going to discuss Connie Mack's championship dynasty of 1910 to 1914. It was the first of two championship dynasties the tall tactician created in his half-century at the helm of the old Philadelphia Athletics. To help us understand the dynasty is Lee Freedman, author of Connie Mack's first dynasty, the Philadelphia Athletics, 1910 to 1914, published by McFarland Books. Welcome to the podcast, Lou.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Let's begin with your inspiration for the book. Major League Baseball has witnessed several championship dynasties over the decades, including the 1926 through 28 New York Yankees, the 1972 through 1974 Oakland Athletics, the 1923 through 26 Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro Leagues, and even Connie Mack had another dynasty, 29 through 31. Why write about the 1910 through 1914 A's?
Well, a couple reasons. Number one, I love baseball history. I hesitate to use the word student of baseball history, but I am familiar with it pretty closely, have followed it for a long time, and really enjoy reading about the days long before I was born. I'm old, but not that old. And Connie Mack is also a guy whose career I was always fascinated about. And there were some terrific ball players on that A's team that kept on winning. And there was less written about that A's team, perhaps because it goes back more than a century, than some of those other recent dynasties you mentioned. So that attracted me, just the idea that these guys were winners. They were winners early, and they had some stars who we've always heard about, and it gave me the opportunity to read up a little bit on them.
Now, Lou, you wrote for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Was this book in the pipeline at that period of time?
Well, that would be an overstatement because, my days at the Inquirer were really between 1979 and 1984. So, in fact, at that point, I had never even contemplated writing a nonfiction book. That didn't begin as an outlet for me until about 5 years after that. When I was living in Alaska, I wrote all my first books about Alaska, outdoors activities, things like the Iditarod Trail sled dog race. And then I kind of moved over into baseball, and I've had the opportunity to write about 30 books on baseball now. And I'm always looking for new unexplored territory, which is a little more difficult when you're talking about topics in the world of baseball, because so many people, so many millions of Americans are also those students of baseball history.
Mm-hmm. Now, your fascination with Connie Mack, I'm sure, really from the historical sense, because he is considered one of the greatest managers in the history of the game. He was also a shrewd businessman who anticipated many of the trends of the modern game. For example, he was one of the first, if not the first, to sign college players. We know that second baseman Eddie Collins came out of Columbia, shortstop Jack Barry graduated from Holy Cross. Pitchers Jack Combs spent 4 years at Colby, Harry Krause at St. Mary's in Oakland, California. Now, I'm sure he believed that the college-educated players were much better suited than the colorful but dim-witted roustabouts he signed to play a thinking man's sport. Were there other reasons to sign these college athletes?
I think there were a couple of really sound reasons. You're talking about an era where scouting consisted of a friend calling up and say, hey, we got a guy for you. And, he might fit in with you. And he may or may not even ever see such a player play before the guy was sent for a couple-day tryout. So Connie Mack got into a network of friends and coaches at colleges. And they would recommend people because they knew he would be a friendly recipient of such talented players. At that time, I think you'd say, with America being a more agrarian society, that most of the ball players were top college players and came from very rural backgrounds. And that's the guys who made their way to the majors. And Connie Mack kind of had good luck with players who were intelligent and had a good, solid background. So once he had the success, he kept looking in those directions too.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about some of the A's who played on those teams. How many Hall of Famers, for example, were on those dynastic teams?
Well, it was a pretty good crowd. I mean, you had guys like Eddie Collins, who many people considered to be certainly the best second baseman of his era, and certainly I would think most people consider him to still be in the top five, even a century later. He was one guy. You've got guys like, on the pitching staff, such as, Chief Bender, pitchers like Eddie Plank, who was the winningest left-handed pitcher in baseball history for decades. I don't think he was surpassed until Lawrence Vaughn passed him in 1963. So they were loaded. They didn't have as powerful an outfield, interestingly enough. They had what was called the $100,000 infield at the time, which is pretty laughable when you consider baseball salaries today. It would be more like the $100 million infield, I guess, if you had four stars, playing at different positions there. Jack Barry was probably the weakest at shortstop in terms of a hitter. He was a great fielder, but he was never a great hitter. I think he hit in the 270s once in his career. But, unheralded, and some people consider Stuffy McGinnis the greatest fielding first baseman of all time and feel he should be in the Hall of Fame. He's helped solidify that infield. And then at third base, you had Frank Home Run Baker, another Hall of Fame. So that infield was really rock solid. And, and of course, when you talk about Home Run Baker, his home run totals in the dead ball era were nothing compared to what people hit today. There are all kinds of 20 home run hitters, who we, just were on the fringe of being starters in some towns, out hit him now.
Mm-hmm. How about some of the more colorful personalities? I forget if Rube Waddell, who was there at the very beginning of the A's existence, did he make it into 1910, or was he off the team by that time?
Actually, he was with the team. They won a prior pennant, and he was with them. I think it was 1908 when they won that one. And they didn't win at all. They lost to the New York Giants. But Waddell was around, and he was his quirky self, as you hinted at, a guy who historians look at and say, this guy was sort of off the charts with his antics, staring up at airplanes to call timeout without calling timeout games, wondering, with the fans wondering if he was ever going to throw to home plate, literally running out of the ballpark to chase fire engines and things like that. I think for many decades, people sort of looked at him as sort of this comedian type of fellow. But when I started to read up on him, in context a little bit of this research, I kind of got a little queasy feeling about thinking that, it was all made in jest. There were hints that perhaps he was mentally ill, which would be a little less humorous if he was doing these oddball things. So it may be a little uncomfortable to just kind of say, well, yes, he was one of the great baseball comedians of all time. If he was really caused by a mental illness, it kind of takes on a different viewpoint.
Sure. One of the players who really, I think, should have been part of the dynasty was Shoeless Joe Jackson. He made his major league debut with the A's in 1908 at the age of 19, but he played in only 5 games the following season, and then Mack traded him to Cleveland in July of 1910 for Briss Lord. Why did Mack trade a player who was later considered the greatest natural hitter in the history of the game?
From a distance, and putting it just that way, certainly with 20/20 hindsight, you'd have to ask that question and say, why would anybody trade this superstar? And I went into it with the same idea, thinking, my word, how good would they have been? Because their weakness was the outfield. And, and you throw a 400 hitter into that dynasty and you go, wow. But the problem was, in that early age, at that young age, Shoeless Joe was perpetually homesick for the South. He just could not adjust to big cities of the North. And he would be jumping the team, and Mack would have to send people after him and say, come on back, Joe, we really want you to play. And he would just never going to be comfortable there. So even then, I still wondered, did he really get value for him? Did he have to do it? And it wasn't until after Shoeless Joe really grew up a little bit, you could say, and realized if he was going to pursue his dream and really play at the top level of the game, he had to adjust to one of those small numbers of big cities with Major League Baseball, or toil in, basic obscurity in some Class C team in the South. So he finally made the call to master his fears and his discomfort. Said, yeah, I guess if I'm going to get another chance, and he makes it big in Cleveland and then with the White Sox. And Woods things have changed for Shoeless Joe. If he'd never been a member of the White Sox during the 8-man out scandal, I mean, we can only guess if he would have, if wasn't even around, if he's playing for another team, how different his career might have turned out.
Yeah, that's a woulda, shoulda, coulda, as you were suggesting before. But I think if Mack had stayed with him, and I think there was a commitment there because, of course, Jackson was illiterate, and Mack hired a tutor for him. I know that he went AWOL during one of the series in Philadelphia, and Mack found out he was homesick, so he paid for the entire Jackson clan to come up from Greenville, South Carolina, and spend a week in Philly to watch Shoeless Joe play. So I think Mack did care, and I can't help but feel that if he just stayed with Jackson for a while longer, things might have been different. I mean, it's difficult to believe that Connie Mack's players would have thrown a World Series to get back at him for being cheap, as was the case with Charles Comiskey. So I think I'd like to believe that his story might have ended a little bit differently. But as you say, you never can tell.
But I would like to believe that as well. I agree. Yeah. But I'd like to think that he would have, if he had just that little more time and to make that decision and choice where to stick with Philadelphia, because I don't know why he would have hated Philadelphia any more than Cleveland or Chicago at that time. It was from within, and it was from what was home calling him back, not so as much. I mean, he felt like a little bit lost in a big city. He was used to the small town life. But what was pulling him away was not so much how he was treated, because I think, Mack did care. And Mack recognized his talent and wanted him to succeed. And it would have been a great thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, Lou, we have a lot of young listeners. The younger generation tends to favor podcasts over sports talk radio because of its sensationalism. And I know that this generation is not familiar with some of the idiosyncratic practices that went on during the dead ball era. And one of those practices was hiring hunchbacks or dwarfs to serve as bat boys and frankly good luck charms, something that would be considered blatant discrimination today.
Certainly very politically incorrect. That was what
absolutely.
They got their job for.
Right, and Mack did have one of those. His name was Louis Van Zelst, the rather diminutive hunchback who served as the A's bat boy and good luck charm, and whenever the hitters would go up to bat, they'd rub his hunchback for good luck. In your research, did you come across much information about Van Zelst?
Very limited, because he died at a young age. The reason given for him having his condition as a hunchback was given as a reason of an illness. And I yet don't know what that illness was, but I don't know what causes something like that. But he was that boy in 1910 for home games most of the time, though he did also make some road trips with the team, and he was on hand for the World Series. So that there was that superstition that he did bring them good luck, and he was around for those prime years. However, he fell ill from another disease, Bright's disease, in 1915, and he died at the age of 20.
Wow.
I don't know how much more is really known about his life besides that time in the limelight. And that's one of the reasons he did not travel as much with the team and made only limited road trips because of that. Because the team was actually concerned about his perpetual health and his limited good health, I guess is the way to put that. But yes, they did, that was a superstitious era, and they did believe in that if you rubbed his back, good luck would be transmitted to you. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the stories I had read about Van Zelst was that the A's, I guess, in their the second time they met the New York Giants in the World Series, which would have been 1911 because the A's and the Giants played in 1905 and the A's lost. But the second time they met, Van Zelst was directed by Mack to go and rent a circus elephant and parade it around the infield before the first World Series game played at Philadelphia, which would totally be consistent with Mack and his very unusual sense of humor. But I guess, what I'm getting at here is the rivalry between John McGraw and Connie Mack, which dated to 1902 when Mack first established the A's in Philadelphia, and he went right ahead and tried to raid the Philadelphia Phillies roster of star players like Napoleon Lajoie, and McGraw, after he did that, predicted that the A's would be the white elephants or money losers of the new American League because of stunts like that. And, of course, Mack, amused by the remark, adopted the white elephant as the team's symbol. How much of this was showmanship, or did the two managers really dislike each other?
I think going back to that very beginning, there was a lot of ill feeling because Mack was raiding the established National League teams. And, in fact, he went to court over Lajoie's services, and he lost that in the court, and it ended up being a very complicated case after the first year where he had to dispose of him, and Lajoie then was actually banned from making appearances in Philadelphia with the A's that year while the court case was pending. And McGraw was a guy who was very gruff, held a grudge, and it lasted for a little while. But I think gradually, in fact, we got to remember the only prior year to the strike year of our recent vintage that there was not a World Series played after it was first founded was because McGraw held his team out, figuring the Giants were the champions of the National League. They didn't need to prove themselves against the upstart American League challenger. But then he came around to competing in the World Series for the betterment of the game and probably a bit of pressure put on him. And I think over the time after that, the years after that, as they aged somewhat together, there was a mutual respect, and there was a much better relationship between McGraw and Mack. And at the very first All-Star game, right after McGraw was in ill health, it was soon before his death, they were the honorary first managers. And there's I think a famous picture where they're actually holding the bat. It looks like they're choosing up sides, like in a Sandlot game of Mack and McGraw together. So I think there was a mellowing out where they eventually gained mutual respect, partially because of longevity. There was longest-serving managers. They were the ones that outlasted everybody else. And, and they both had their share of victories. So I think that gradually they had a better relationship as you get towards the end of John McGraw's life in the early 1930s.
Now, we know that Mack and his A's lost the 1905 World Series to McGraw's Giants, but then Mack got even twice, beating the Giants in 1911 and again in 1913. Which of those teams, Lou, do you think, 1911 or 1913, was his best? Or maybe it was 1910.
Well, that's the thing. They were so similar.
Right.
There wasn't much to choose between them. Because, almost all the key guys were the same people. There were some subs on the periphery. And, once they added, the first group, a couple years passed, and there was turnover, no more Wu Waddell and a few people like that. So I'm really not sure if you can, say that. I mean, you got guys like Jack Coombs having his greatest year of his life, winning 31 games and then becoming injured and ill. So, probably, when they had Coombs and Bender and Plank together, that pitching staff was virtually untouchable. And we're talking about an age where the pitching staff, an era, to be clear, where the pitching staff were pretty small. None of this the current era where we got, 12, 13 guys on the staff, and relief the pitchers left, right, and ambidextrous. So, there were, these guys came in relief as well. So you're talking about the fundamental aspect of 3 or 4 guys carrying whole pitching staff. But so I'm not sure how much you can pick between them. He never made, after Shoeless Joe left, who would have been the guy who stood out in the outfield was fairly average. It was solid, but those guys were hitting 280, not 340. So, you had the pitching staff in the infield, and those guys held together for as long as, they could stay together.
Mm-hmm. Now, the A's won the 4th and the final pennant of that first championship dynasty in 1914. And almost immediately after they lost the World Series to the so-called Miracle Braves of Boston, Mack started trading or selling players. Some historians believe that fire sale was due to Mack's suspicion that many of his players were going to jump to the new renegade Federal League, and he wanted to get his money's worth before they left. Others argue that Mack felt Philadelphia baseball fans had grown bored with winning and that it was more exciting for them to follow a young group of players as they developed. What's your take on that, Lou?
I put almost all of it on his suspicions of the Federal League. And the irony there is I think he overreacted and made some of the rasher decisions of his whole career by thoroughly dismantling the team in such a quick burst of time. He was angry that he thought the players were distracted during that 1914 World Series, that they were thinking of potential, and they might have had secret offers already for the Federal League, and that he had been so loyal to them that he felt personally betrayed by every individual who entertained an offer from somebody else. And then they go out and they lose to the Braves, who he felt they never should have lost to. But I thought he was so piqued, so angry about that he overreacted. And he could have played it differently, gone through case by case on some of those guys to keep them around, and other guys, give some of them more money, tell some of them maybe, and he didn't have to purge the entire team. I thought that was extreme and the biggest mistake of his managing career. And it was kind of even proven because the Federal League had no staying power. Some of those guys went off, had some success for a year or two in the Federal League, and the Federal League went out of business, and by that time, the Philadelphia Athletics were the worst team in baseball. He had expunged too many people, too much talent, and whether he was cocky about being able to replace them and build right away, he was definitely proven wrong. And it took a long time for the Athletics to recover because of those extreme measures that Mack took.
Yeah, there's two things that strike me about that fire sale. First, how indignant Mack was. because he had committed the same crime when he came to Philadelphia in 1902. I mean, he was trying to lure, the Phillies to the A's, which is exactly what the Federal League was doing to his players. So it was kind of this, irony that he was stung by the same bee. The other thing that strikes me, and I really do agree with you about this, he learned a hard lesson, that you don't go conducting a fire sale, that you break it up over time. And he did learn that lesson because after 1931, after his second dynasty, he created, parity in the American League by slowly trading off or selling his players. So the A's went from first place down to second, third, and then after he got rid of Jimmy Fox, I guess it was in 35, that's when they started to bottom out, and he never saw really first place again at the end of a season. So I think he learned from that mistake. But I've always wondered that.
Well, it is amazing, really, that he was that self-righteous. I mean, the realism part of things should have struck home to him was, we were doing this, when we came into existence by raiding the Phillies. So why wouldn't they try to steal our ball players? How he could have coped at it with it better. I mean, it's not like they had a tragic season. They won the pennant, went to the World Series. So rather than just breaking everybody up, sending everybody somewhere else, they definitely could have approached it a different way. Maybe, we trade, we let Jack Coombs go. Then Chief Bender's near the end. So, but not everybody, not Eddie Collins, who was still in his prime, guys like that. Protect yourself. Don't go, from 100 wins to 45 wins. I mean, if he didn't think the fans were coming before, why would they come to see a team that was that bad?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Lou, you've written other baseball books. Where does this stand, in terms of favorites, in your own mind? I mean, was this your favorite book? What are some of the others that you've written?
Oh, I've written so many. I mean, I don't know if I have favorites as much as really throwing myself into each one each time and really enjoying it, and also learning things myself about the guys that I'd always heard about, following the game in my long life since the time my first Red Sox game, I think, that I attended growing up in Boston was in 1960. So, I've been really close to watching baseball for an awfully long time. So this was just one of those fun projects where I got a chance to find out more about Jack Combs and Chief Bender and guys I've heard about my whole life. I really enjoy exploring the history, and there's been a lot written about Connie Mack, so I wasn't going to have a chance to write about him really research him unless I had a narrow slice of one of his achievements to explore. I've got a new one coming out on biography of Warren Spahn in a month or two. So,
that's great. That's
surprised
great
to find out that there was never an adult biography of Warren Spahn. Only I read the Sport Magazine Library biography of Warren Spahn when I was 10. And I still have it. It costs probably 50 cents.
Will this be published by McFarland as well?
Actually, it's by Skyhorse in New York.
Skyhorse, wow, nice.
They're coming soon to a baseball city near you.
Oh, that's wonderful. That is wonderful.
I'd always like to go. I'm a guy who would like to go back to 1980, speaking of Philly, and relive that year a little bit, having lived it in Philadelphia and been there the night they won the title. We were just talking about it the other day in light of the Eagles Super Bowl championship, wondering how I remember walking out of Veterans Stadium that night when the Phillies won, and what a mess it was outside. Some people celebrating. And I don't even know what kind of parade they might have had 38 years ago, compared to the routine championship parades now with 1 million people. But they sure were celebrating outside the back door.
Yeah, I was down in Center City, Philadelphia. Of course, the Super Bowl was played in Minnesota, but it really didn't matter because Philadelphians went crazy on Sunday night, and my son and I watched it with a family member downtown, and we all walked down Broad Street to City Hall, and it was crazy. I mean, it was absolutely crazy, and
that's exactly what I would imagine.
There were
Philadelphia sports fan, and to appreciate it that way.
Oh, absolutely, and this was the Eagles' first Super Bowl victory, and the Phillies, that in 1980, that was their first World Series title, and there were 1.5 million people at the parade. But of course, and I hate to admit this, but it's true, Philadelphia is a football town, and I guarantee you they're going to have probably close to 3 million people at that parade tomorrow. And I don't care how cold it is. I don't care if it snows or begins snowing. Those people are going to stay there because that's how much they love football and this team in particular. So
I believe every word of that as a likelihood. Yeah. I remember when they went to the Super Bowl in '80 against the Raiders too.
Yeah,
back in that era.
Yeah,
you can't overlook that Eagles title in 1960 with Norm Van Brocklin, right?
That's right. Yeah, a lot of young fans don't realize that
there
were
the Super Bowl
4
era.
NFL titles in Philadelphia before the Super Bowl age, and people completely, forget about the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets of 1926.
I was just going to ask you if you were counting Frankfurt.
Yeah, Frankfurt, then the 48-49 Eagles and the 60 Eagles.
Yep.
But people forget about Frankfurt, and that's a book I want to write because there's a lot of personal sentiment that goes back. One of my very first history teachers was a kid at the time of that title, and he actually put together a scrapbook on that team, and I always wanted to, follow it up with a book. So that's on my back burner. How about yours? You got any other books in the works?
Well, I have a book that should have been out already. It's the history of the passing game through Texas Tech University, and I just emailing about it today, sort of saying, when are you putting it out? It should have been out before this season. And that goes from the first forward pass thrown under the new college rules in 1906 by St. Louis University, right up through Tom Brady. So,
wow.
The email was actually, do we have to change a few words because Brady was in another Super Bowl? That was really what we were talking about. So that's ready to go. And I have a biography of Jake LaMotta coming out.
Oh, wow. You go across the board, don't you? Wow.
Oh, yeah.
That's great.
I covered boxing for the Inquirer during its last great heyday, during that time period. Yeah. It was just a terrific time to cover boxing.
Was Larry Merchant still in town when you were there, or did he go to New York already?
No, he was on TV. He was on TV already at that point.
Yeah.
But there were 4 Philadelphia newspapers when I got there. People don't remember the Philadelphia Journal, as well as the Bulletin, Daily News, and Inquirer, and everybody had a full-time boxing writer because there was so much boxing in Philadelphia, and it overlapped with the time they first went to Atlantic City. And there were casino fights every week.
Yeah.
All the biggest fights, except for the heavyweight title, which still went to Las Vegas. There were title fight in Atlantic City every week almost. Middleweight title fights, light heavyweight title fights, you name it. Guys from Marvin Hagler to Michael Spinks regularly, all up and down the line there. Jeff Chandler, one of my favorites, the bantamweight champion of the world from Philadelphia. All of those guys. I wrote a book on Philadelphia fighters and covering that era. That came out a few years ago too. So, and I revisited things with those guys 30 years later. Guys like, Dwight Braxton, Dwight Muhammad Kai, and looking up those guys. Visited Jeff. He was living in Delaware at the time, but that was a treat. Seeing Larry Holmes, going out to his place. It was about 30 years after their heyday, and it was certainly fun to bring back those memories.
Kind of a boys' of summer of boxing, huh?
Only Philly. It was Philly only.
Yeah.
It was just the contenders, and there were so many of them at the time. Philadelphia was just such the cornerstone of the game at that point. and everybody pretty much came through. You know?
Mm-hmm. Well, listeners, the title of this book is Connie Mack's First Dynasty, the Philadelphia Athletics, 1910 to 1914. You could get it on Amazon, or you could purchase it at McFarland at www.mcfarlandpub.com. Lou, thanks for being with us and for writing such an interesting book. And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.